Hello again and welcome to War Stories, behind the scenes tales from the front lines of the media. I'm your host, Tom Curley. And if you're new to the show, this is a show where basically myself and friends of mine who worked in the industry, specifically the broadcasting industry, I was a TV director for CBS for almost 40 years. We get together and we tell old stories, stuff that happened in our past, stuff that happened behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, but mostly stuff that's either very funny or under the category of you can't make this shit up. And I would, of course, not be able to do this without my cohort in crime, the inimitable, which turns out is a word, Garry Armstrong. Garry, how you doing?
Doing just well. It's a wonderful summer-like day up here today. So terrific to work today. And it's not work.
Yes. And it's not work. No. This is definitely not work. So before we start with today's insanity, again, unfinished business from last week. Last week we had an old friend of yours, Peter Savioli, and he told a story about the early days of television when remotes had first come out. He discovered that if he jingled his keys, it would turn the TV sets off in the studio. So he would just go around jingling his keys and nobody knew what was going on. And it reminded me of something, but I didn't get a chance to bring it up. There used to be this thing called, I don't know if it's still around to this day, but it's called phone phreaks. And these are guys who figured out ways to break into Ma Bell. Most of this is back when Ma Bell was a single company. And one of the most famous phone phreakers was a guy named Captain Crunch. And he got the nickname because he discovered that you used to get this whistle. It was a toy that came in a box of Captain Crunch cereal. And he discovered that if you blew the whistle into a payphone, now a payphone, kiddies, there used to be these things years ago where there were phones, actual phones all over the city that if you put a dime into, you could make a phone call. Well, anyway, he discovered that if he blew the whistle into the phone, it mimicked the set of frequencies that unlocked the phone. It was the same thing as putting a dime in. And he could make, and so now people were making free phone calls all over the place. And then, so anyway, it was crazy. So also before we get started, so Garry, I hear that you had your virginity busted in a very unique sense. You have actually just finished watching or are now watching the original Star Trek series with William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy.
After all these years.
Now, after all these years, how did you manage to miss that?
I just thought about it, Tom. It occurred to me that when Star Trek, the original series, was running, I was working at ABC at that time, so I was working all of these weird schedules. I don't remember when I was home at that point because I was working days, I was working evenings, I was working overnights. And by the time I got home, I was probably just dead tired and didn't watch that much television. Suffice it to say, I simply missed the entire series. And so we just finished binging it last night, I believe. And what occurred to me, for most of you folks who are watching, who have watched the original Star Trek series, is that Captain Kirk frequently goes to these planets where he's not wanted. And the crew wants him not to go. The people on the planet tell him he's not welcome, and he just ignores them and goes ahead. And it reminded me of one of your series, Get Off My Lawn. I think the title for that show could have been Get Out of My Universe. It's just startling to see what those scripts. I know they were doing, Tom, and you jump in because you watched them, and you also that show enabled you to go on and do something very similar of your own. But that show was doing a lot of allegories to news of the day, Vietnam and Richard Nixon and things like that. But the allegories were so obvious, and they repeated themselves and repeated themselves. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The whole point of the show, you got to realize this was 1966 through 19 69. Okay, it went on for 3 seasons.
69, yeah.
72 episodes. And remember what was going on back then. There was a lot of turmoil. Now, you couldn't talk about political issues like race or misogyny or anything like communism. But Gene Roddenberry, who was a genius, figured out that if he put the plot in a science fiction outer space thing where it was another civilization, he could make comments on all these things. And that's one of the reasons that the show it was so popular and is popular to this day. Classic example, the one with Frank Gorshin, where there's only 2 of his species left, and they're hunting each other down, and they're black and white. Half of their face is black and half of their face is white. That's is the rest of their body. And finally, at the end, Spock goes, "Well, why do you guys hate each other? You look exactly the same." And Frank Gorshin says, "Are you kidding? I'm black on the left half. He's black on the right." And I mean,
that broke me up.
It was brilliant. But now the interesting thing is, I don't know whether Gene Roddenberry did it on purpose. I think it was a mistake because the writers made a big mistake in the beginning. They created the Prime Directive. And the Prime Directive was that you can't interfere in any species that hasn't achieved warp drive. Okay? Well, that was really great for one episode. And I think Roddenberry and all the writers realized, wait a minute, if we can't interfere in everybody's business, we don't have any plots. So basically it came down to how is Kirk going to tell the Prime Directive to go fuck itself? And he did a hell of a job. Now, I did a Get Off My Lawn. Actually, I'm going to do a Get Off My Lawn. I wrote this as a blog a long time ago. Problem solving in the Star Trek universe. All right. Basically, problem solving in the Star Trek universe. There's only a few basic problems. Problem number 1, if it's a computer that's gone rogue or has taken over a world, Spock either gets it to compute the value of pi, which occupies all its memory, or he unplugs it. If it's any kind of a sudden disease, McCoy will make a cure for it, all the while griping that he's a doctor, not a fill in the blank. If it's anything to do with the ship or anything mechanical, Scotty will fix it at the last moment, all the while complaining that he doesn't have enough time, and I need more power, Captain. And for all other problems, Captain Kirk either kisses it or punches it in the face. And that basically solves all the Star Trek problems, you know. So anyway,
I understand also how I was going to say, I understand now in retrospect why you folks made fun of William Shatner, his work as Captain Kirk. I'm thinking of one of the episodes where a woman who was his former girlfriend or whatever, is now seeking to take over the Enterprise, and she takes over Kirk's body. So William Shatner is playing himself, but also is playing the woman who's taken over his body, and his acting nuances were hilarious.
Hilarious, but what was better was the woman. She had him nailed. She had him down so good. Yeah. It was phenomenal. Well, you know, here's Marilyn and her friend Mitch. Back in college, I used to do a 1-hour radio comedy sketch show called Fulton's Folly. And Marilyn originated one of our regular features, which was a parody of Star Trek, because at the time, it was 1972, and Star Trek had just gone into syndication. And that's when Star Trek blew up. All right. It didn't get a lot of great ratings in the 60s, believe it or not. And believe it or not, its direct competition on CBS was Lost in Space. They used to consider those equivalent shows. Wow. Yeah, really. Yeah. I mean, from Star Trek to, oh dear, warning, danger, Will Robinson, you know.
Warning, biophysical experiments extremely dangerous to Earth people.
So anyway, she wrote a parody of Star Trek called Sterling Bronson Space Engineer. Why that? Well, if we said Star Trek, we would have gotten sued. And it was an inside joke. It was the name of our chief engineer, Teddy Ronenberger. And in it, it was about the adventures of the United Federated Organization ship, the UFO Sloth.
This is the story of the United Federated Organization ship Sloth, as it and its crew of contentious cosmonauts blunders aimlessly through the reaches of interstellar, intergalactic, and interlocutory space. Its 5-year mission to go where no man has bothered to go before.
And I was the commanding officer, Captain James T. Clerk. My first officer was a Hephaestian named Mr. Spook. Our communications officer was an Irish lady named Lieutenant O'Hara, and and Ensign Tolstoy was our helm operator, and I think the other guy was Lieutenant Guru. He was our weapons officer. He was from Gandhi 5. The problem was that anytime we got into battle, he refused to fire the guns because he was into peace. So the show went on. I'll show you. I'll give you a link where you can actually see it. But it was arguably the first full-length parody of Star Trek that was ever done, and I'm proud of
goodness.
it. Yes, I am proud of it to this day. And Marilyn wrote the first 6 episodes, and they were hilarious. Basically, it was the first 6 episodes. They were trying to get out of the transporter room and beam down to a planet, and they couldn't even manage to do that. So anyway, on with today's show. So what stories do we have today? You said you've got a couple. Tell me about it.
Yeah, I have one that, I have to admit, I was in bed last night trying to think of what we would do today. And then I remembered the Alfred Hitchcock story that is in my past. And it really goes back. Before we began the podcast, I checked my Leonard Maltin movie trivia book. And this goes back to 1972. Alfred Hitchcock was in Boston to promote one of his latter movies, not one of his better movies, one of his latter movies called Frenzy. And I wanted to do the interview with him, and he was still obviously very big news for local media. So the other TV stations had taped interviews with him, and the entertainment reporter for WBZ, which is one of the competing stations in Boston, had him on, and I was getting a little nervous, and one of the assistants came over and said, not to worry, we'll get him out. We'll have him in front of your camera live just before you go to network news, which meant I had to have him on between 6:25 and 6:28 or 6:29. Well, he doesn't show up at 6:25, at 6:26, and I'm looking around, and finally the master walks out of the theater. And first thing I noticed, Tom, was that his face was really flushed. It was between pink and red. That should have been a giveaway. And he sort of wobbled over to me and said, I think I'm supposed to be on the camera with you, young man. And I said, Mr. Hitchcock, it's such a pleasure to have you here. And he said, who are you? And I said, I'm the person interviewing you. He said, no, I mean, who are you? I said, my name is Garry Armstrong. And he said, oh, very, very good. But let's have a little cup of tea. What I didn't realize was that he had been imbibing before he went on camera. I don't know what he did for the other station, but by the time he hit my station, he was well into his 16th or 17th cup of tea, if we'll call it that. And I started to ask him about the movie, and he said, wait a minute, young man, I will do it. I said, all right, Mr. Hitchcock. And he said, this movie, Frenzy. I said, what? He said, Frenzy. I said, you mean frenzy, don't you? He said, who's the director here? I said, well, you are, Mr. Hitchcock. He said, well, Frenzy is one of my greatest. And Mr. Hitchcock, are you having some problems? And he said, no, why don't you have some lemonade? He really thought it was a drink. So he gave me the lemonade. Turns out it was lemonade. I handed it back to him. He took a sip. And as he started his next sentence, as he sipped the drink, realizing it wasn't alcohol, he spat the drink out in my face on live television. And he just started laughing. And he said, oh, good one. Now, what were we talking about? So I turned around trying to be a smartass, and I said, we were talking about Frenzy. And he said, young man, how many years have you worked on television? And I said, a number of years. And he said, the movie isn't Frenzy, it's Frenzy. I said, no, it's Frenzy, Mr. Hitchcock. And he said, I said that. And as he's going on back and forth, a very well endowed young lady walked by, and it got his attention right away. And he said, well, I would do that one right away. I said, Mr. Hitchcock, we're live on television. And he said, well, all the more reason for me to do that. Don't you think she was rather attractive? Let's get back to Frenzy. And I said, Mr. Hitchcock, call me Alfie, young man. I said, no, I can't. I don't really know. I said, call me Alfie. Yes, Mr. Hitchcock. Now, as for Frenzy, and I said, why don't we just talk about the plot of the movie? And he said, frankly, I don't remember it very well. It's not a very good movie, but I hope it brings in a lot of money. Frenzy, my dear friends, is not a very good movie, but I promise you, you will enjoy it. What's your name again, young man? And I said, Mr. Hitchcock, we're running out of time, and it's been wonderful having you here. I've watched most of your movies. He said, no, you haven't. You can't be that old. I said, one of my favorite movies, Mr. Hitchcock, was The 39 Steps. And he said, you saw that? And I said, yes, I really enjoyed Robert Donat. And he said, what about Madeleine Carroll? And now Madeleine Carroll, for people who are familiar with old movies, was a nice actress. She was well endowed. So I said, Madeleine Carroll really showed a nice taste and sense for impeccable comedic timing and acting. And he said, well, that's true, but she still was well endowed, young man. Wouldn't you say that? And I said, well, if you say so, Mr. Hitchcock, call me Alfie. And I said, well, time is up, Mr. Hitchcock. And he said, have another lemonade, young man. This time it really was booze. He took a sip of it, and then spat that out in my face. And that's when I heard in my IFB, that's a rap, Garry. So that was Alfred Hitchcock. You don't make that stuff up.
Wow. No, you can't make stuff like that up. He went to the Barbara Walters School of Broadcasting. Wow, that is on the IFB.
They were saying they were asking me whether or not I had been imbibing, and I said no, it was the guest. And then someone said, "Why did you let him continue?" I said, "But it was Alfred Hitchcock. What was I supposed to do?" Well, you should have somehow delicately escorted him off camera. And I said, "You don't do that with Alfred Hitchcock." And no one said anything else.
What do you? I mean, that's absolutely insane. That's great. All right, changing gears a little bit. I have a story, and we try to tie these things together, and sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. This is a story that I have told many, many times over the years. It's a true story, as all of them are, and it's sort of relevant today because it took place back at CBS FM, WCBS FM in New York, and it's about terrorism. Now, terrorism is sort of a thing these days, if you think about it. Right. We had 9/11, back in the good old days when all the terrorists were from other countries. Nowadays, we just grow our own. But, it's a thing, everyday terrorist threats. Well, back in the 1970s, this would have been probably around like 76, 77, terrorism wasn't a big thing in America. There was the 1972 Munich Olympics, where the Israeli team were all slaughtered by terrorists. Right. But other than that, terrorism wasn't a big thing. But our general manager, for some strange reason, was obsessed with terrorists. And specifically, he was obsessed that terrorists were going to come in and invade WCBS FM. Now, why? None of us knew. But apparently, this, either they wanted more Chuck Berry, there was too much Chuck Berry. We never knew. So he went to our chief engineer, just the greatest guy on the planet, a guy named Torchy. And Torchy was a character. Torchy started in radio in the 1930s. And in the 1950s, when television came around, they came to him and asked him if he wanted to go and work in television? And he said no, because he didn't think it was going to ever really catch on. And, who knows? Maybe in retrospect, he was right. So anyway, the general manager went to Torchy and he said, I want you to install a button in the center of the rack, okay? A big button. And when you press it, it will turn off the transmitter on top of the Empire State Building. Now, apparently, I guess his scenario is that as the terrorists are coming down the hall invading CBS FM, my last act of my life would be to reach up as I'm being shot in the back, to reach up with my bloodied hand and push that button and deny the terrorists any more Chuck Berry. So Torchy told him, you can't do that. It's illegal. You see, back then you needed a thing called a first-class FCC license to run a transmitter. And not everybody at the station, not all the engineers there had one. I did, but most, Mark Wiener did, but most of the other ones didn't. So he said, you can't do that. And the general manager says, I don't care. Do it anyway. So he did. So one day I came to work and there it was, this button, this big button. Now you got to understand, I'm an engineer. My job is to push buttons, okay?
That button.
I wanted to push that button. I really wanted to push that button, but I couldn't. Because if I did,
wouldn't this be great ratings
I would
now?
take... Oh, well, no, I would
Wouldn't it be
take
great
the
ratings?
transmitter. No, there'd be no ratings. I would kill the transmitter. Now, this is a $38 million a year radio station, and I know that if I took it off the air, it would be frowned upon. And I probably would get a severe tongue lashing. So for about, I'd say a good year, maybe more, I lived with that button. Every day, I learned to ignore it, but sometimes at night, when I was there all alone, damn it, I want to touch that button. So then one night, this is true. It was a Sunday night, 3:00 in the morning. I was the only person there. I was running our public affairs programming, which was basically, back then it was all just religious programming. And the tech phone rang. Now we had a special set of private phone lines, the technical lines, that technicians, every studio in TV, radio, the transmitter all had one. And it rang 3 in the morning. I'm like, why is somebody calling me? I'm the only one here. So I pick up the phone and the guy says, I'm so-and-so I'm at the transmitter on the Empire State Building. I go, oh, hi. He said, do you have a kill switch for the transmitter there? I went, yeah, as a matter of fact, we do. And he says, push it. I went, I can't do that. It would take us off the air. He says, for Christ's sakes, push the fucking button. So there was. I could do it.
Oh, my God.
I relished the moment, man. So I reached up. I wanted to drag the moment out. I went, oh, wow. And I reached up and I pushed the button. And the guy went, yeah, I didn't think that thing was ever hooked up. All right, see you, goodbye. And I was like, what? Not, so I go behind the rack. I go behind the rack and I move all the wires away. And there's the button. Nothing's hooked up to it. It's just a button. So I go to Torchy on Monday, the next day, and I tell him what happened. And I go, what the hell? And he says, I told the general manager it was illegal. He told me to put in a button. I put in a button. I knew nobody would ever press it. True story. Absolutely happened.
Oh my God.
Yes.
That's incredible. That really is incredible. I was just thinking the warped part of my brain with this general manager who is fearful of terrorists. I mean, you had a promo right there. WCBS FM, the station that terrorists listen to. I mean, that's built in. Exactly.
I'm I'm Osama bin Laden, and I love the Saturday Night Suck-Up.
Like Chuck Berry.
So, like Chuck Berry. So you said you had another story. What was that?
Yeah, but it's gonna not play havoc with the one you just told. Anthony Quinn, the late actor, he was living in Rhode Island towards the end of his career and his life, and he came to the TV station to do something for our Black news program, and I heard someone saying, Anthony Quinn is in the building and he's coming up for the Black News interview. And I was working on a news story for the 11 o'clock show. When I heard Anthony Quinn, I stopped my typing and I raced over to the other desk and I said, Anthony Quinn, who's doing it? And they said, well, so-and-so is doing it. And I said, no, I'll do it. And they said, he's coming in to do the Black news program. You're working, and I'm not making this up, you're working on white news. Why don't you stay on white news? We'll do Black news. And I said, but I'll do Anthony Quinn. So they backed off. They allowed me to do the interview. And that was a big mistake. From time to time in my career, I have leapt in and asked the question I shouldn't have asked. So I recalled Anthony Quinn's long career beginning back in the 1930s. He had married Catherine DeMille, one of Cecil B's daughters. So he had it in there. But he was doing a lot of minor roles, bit roles, in which he played stereotype things like Indians, slick back Italian gangsters. So I thought I would ask him, what was it like, given the career that you've had, what was it like playing those really not so nice roles? Did it bother you? And he just stared at me for a long time and he said, I will have you know, Mr. Armstrong, that I worked with and I was admired by Mr. Cecil B. DeMille, Mr. Garry Cooper, Mr. Errol Flynn. They all admired my work. None of my work was stereotypical. Now, I don't know what you're talking about, but you know that I've won an Oscar, I've won several Emmys, I've won several Tonys, and all you can do is ask me about the beginning of my career. How about the beginning of your career, Mr. Armstrong? And I sat there for a moment and I just smiled. He never broke a smile. And I found another question to go to. And he started answering and it went well, but I felt that once again, I had been taught a lesson that you really should think about what you're going to ask. Don't try to be a wise ass. Those are hard lessons that are taught on the job. And it's something that I think a lot of reporters these days don't really understand. If you see interviews and you wonder where these questions come from. But Anthony Quinn, the top to this, as he was leaving the newsroom, he walked over and tapped me on the shoulder and said, nothing personal, but you really should do your homework before doing these interviews. And I said, you're right, sir. You're very right. And he said, but it was good talking to you, and I enjoy the work you do. And he walked away. So much for Zorba the Greek. Damn it.
Yeah. Ask him if he ever knew. Ask him if he ever knew Howard Cosell. Yeah. So.
Yeah, you know these celebrity stories. There are so many of them that there's a reluctance to tell them because for every successful one, you run into. We talked about trying to work with comedians. There are so many of these interviews that just don't go well. They just sink, and you wish you had never reported, or you wish you had never turned the mic on because there was one with Sid Caesar, I think, who he was in town at another station, so everyone went over to the other station. As it turned out, I was the last guy to get Sid Caesar, and he wasn't funny. He was a very unhappy camper. And it's one of those things where you sit and you ask a question and you get a grunt back and there's no place to go. You just die.
Those are the worst.
It's horrible.
Those are the worst.
Oh,
yes,
yeah.
Yes or no questions. Well, anyway, guess what? Did it again.
Again?
We've hit the half-hour
Again?
mark. Again, we've hit the half-hour
Wow.
mark. I think we got most of what we wanted to talk to in. So, of course, now it's time for the plugs. And, of course, we have to start with Serendipity, Seeking Intelligent Life on Earth, the blog that your lovely wife, Marilyn, writes, and you do, and I do, and check it out. Even though we have yet to find intelligent life, we still are trying. And then, of course, our sister podcast, which is Get Off My Lawn with Tom Curley, where we talk about life, the universe, and basically whatever I wrote in the teleprompter. And, of course, my audio theater group, Voicescapes Audio Theater, for the best in audio theater and drama. So, Garry, thanks again. We'll do this again next week. You gave me some more ideas of stuff to talk about. So until then, toodles.